Hi everyone, so this week we're going to be starting the second topic in Unit 4 on agriculture and GMOs, which stands for genetically modified organisms. The first section we're going to talk about is agriculture, and starting out, I just want you to think about if you've ever thought about what part of a plant you're actually eating, whether it's the seeds, the roots, the stems, or the leaves. After you've thought about that for a second, there are examples where we eat all of those different types of things. Take a look at these two heads of broccoli here. We have this non-organic one for $1.40 and this organic one for $2. And think about if you were at the grocery store right now with those two heads of broccoli in front of you, which one you would decide to buy and why. So those two heads of broccoli appear to be identical. What distinguishes one as organic versus one as non-organic, and why is the organic one so much more expensive? These are all things that we will get into throughout the course of the lecture today. So just briefly here, I'm going to talk about the difference between something that's certified organic and something that is just labeled as 100% natural. So these two things are not the same. The 100% natural label is not standardized and really not informative at all because there is no standardization behind it. Whereas the official USDA organic label is certified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it means that 95% or more of the ingredients are free of genetic modification. Organic foods are also free of synthetic pesticides and free of synthetic fertilizers. So thus the USDA label is going to quickly convey information about the way in which a product or our broccoli is grown. So getting into agriculture here, there was a big shift in agriculture in the 1950s towards the most efficient way to produce food, which is the monoculture farm. So that's the first thing that we're going to look at. So mono means one, and monoculture farming is going to focus on one single specific crop. Monoculture farming was developed after World War II to increase food production at a low cost to consumers, and is the predominant method of farming in America today. Although the type of crop grown on a plot may rotate over the years, monoculture farming generally focuses on producing a large amount of one crop. So the focus of these farms is to produce really large yields of one specific crop, and to do that, farmers have to use some new agricultural technology like synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and big machines to increase production of this one crop. And so if we look at who actually is the farmer, so in your mind, picture a small, or not necessarily a small, but like what you think of a farm, and then we'll talk about this briefly. So in smaller farms, generally the owner of the land is also the operator of the farm. And so the owner is controlling what is planted, what is being grown, and then they will most likely have several workers depending on the size of the farm just to do all the manual labor. Larger farms, like these monoculture farms, the landowner is a lot of times one specific family or even a corporation, and they really have nothing to do with what is grown on the farm. And so that's where the operator comes into play, because the operator is going to be the person in charge of actually maintaining that farm. And a lot of times these big farm areas are owned by either a single family or large corporations, and then the operator is going to oversee workers to work that land. And so the monoculture farms have almost unanimously this design right here, where the owner is typically not the operator of the farm. And monoculture farms, even though they produce a lot of food, they definitely have some problems, specifically when we're looking at the impact of monoculture farms on the environment. This quote here is from Michael Pollan, and basically, the food we grow uses only the sun, rain, and carbon dioxide. Yet author Michael Pollan has written that through our industrial farming, we are ultimately eating oil and contributing directly to greenhouse gas production. So just take a second and try and think about what he means by this quote. So we're not going to discuss it right now. Instead, we're going to get into the important process of photosynthesis and how plants work and how they produce energy, and then we'll circle back around to that quote. So in the process of photosynthesis, solar energy is converted to chemical energy, and that chemical energy is stored in the bonds of sugar molecules, so glucose. The actual chemical equation for the process of photosynthesis is CO2 plus H2O plus sunlight is going to create sugar in the form of glucose and O2, or oxygen. So these are the inputs, these are the outputs of photosynthesis. This here is just a visual overview. So the water that's used in photosynthesis is going to come from the ground, and CO2 that's used in photosynthesis is going to come from the air. Some products of photosynthesis, the main product is C6H12O6, which is glucose, and then a byproduct of photosynthesis is going to be oxygen that you and I breathe. Photosynthesis takes place in a chloroplast, and the pigment chlorophyll is going to be what actually absorbs sunlight in the chloroplast. Chlorophyll is the primary pigment, and pigment is just a light-absorbing molecule in chloroplasts. And so that is why plants are green. Light in the blue, violet, and then the orange-red ranges is going to be absorbed by that pigment, but light in the green and yellow range is going to be reflected, which is why plants appear green. So plants look green because chlorophyll is going to reflect the green light and absorb the red, violet, and orange colors. However, the leaves of many deciduous trees are going to change color in the fall. So can you think of an explanation for this? The explanation for this is that the leaves start to lose the chlorophyll, pigments in the leaves start to break down, and then the primary pigments are going to be something called carotenoids and xanthophylls, which do reflect that red and orange color. And so once the chlorophyll breaks down, those other pigments are going to reflect their colors and absorb that green light. And so that's why leaves change color in the fall. Photosynthesis is going to occur in two linked stages. So in the first stage, the light reactions capture sunlight and store it in high energy molecules. And in the second stage, the Calvin cycle is going to use those high energy molecules to produce sugar or glucose. So essentially, a summary is that photosynthesis captures the energy in sunlight and stores it in the form of sugar molecules. We're going to take a look back at this slide here and just see, this is the chloroplast right here. So energy from sunlight and water is going to come in here. And then this is where those first reactions are going to take place. And then over here is where the Calvin cycle is going to take place. So the light reactions take place in the thylakoid disc. This whole thing is the chloroplast. The light reactions take place in the thylakoid disc, and then the Calvin cycle is going to take place over here. Besides photosynthesis, plants also rely on their reproductive structures. So this just goes over some of the reproductive structures in a plant. Flowers, fruit, and seeds aid in angiosperm reproduction. So the flower is the reproductive organ of angiosperms, and the main function of a flower is to produce and receive pollen. Flower structures are also going to hold the developing embryo, which is eventually dispersed as a seed. So how this works, the anther is going to be the part of the flower that releases pollen. The pollen can then land on a stigma right there. And then the sperm from the pollen grain moves through the pollen tube to the egg where fertilization occurs. And that's when a haploid sperm fertilizes the haploid egg. And then the embryo sac within the ovule is the female gametophyte. So female gamete right there, male gamete right there. The sperm carrying the pollen grain is the male gametophyte. A seed is an embryonic plant, so a seed consists of a dormant embryonic plant and endosperm. The endosperm is going to be a food supply that will be absorbed during germination. So this right here is the cotyledon, or the embryonic first leaves. If you remember the term monocot and dicot from last lecture, that's what that's referring to. This is the endosperm, so the food source for the seed. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms have seeds. A brief aside, so why does popcorn pop? So a popcorn seed has two types of endosperm, a hard outer layer and a soft, moist core. What do you think happens when the seed is heated? Heating is going to turn the water in the soft endosperm to steam, which expands, leading the kernel to explode and make that popping noise. The white, puffy endosperm is then going to solidify into that tasty treat that goes good with butter. So that is why popcorn pops. It is the endosperm of the seed. A fruit is going to be a mature ovary. So after fertilization, the ovary may expand and thicken to form a protective container around the seeds, which that is now called a fruit. So how is a fruit different from a nut? So in most cases, a nut is actually going to be a type of fruit because it has the seed contained in a protective coating with that endosperm. So we're going to go back to this quote now and back to agriculture. I just wanted to hit on some of the main characteristics of plants. So once again, the food we grow uses only the sun, rain, and carbon dioxide, yet author Michael Pollan has written that through our industrial farming, we're ultimately eating oil and contributing directly to greenhouse gas production. And what he's getting at is that monoculture farms especially require vast inputs of fossil fuel to make the farm run. So monoculture farms use fossil fueled vehicles to till the soil, plant seeds, spray chemicals, and harvest the crop. And a startling statistic is that today farming accounts for 20% of the gasoline and diesel fuel consumed in the United States. And so one of the main things these monoculture farms need is fertilizer to fertilize the plants. But what that fertilizer does is it doesn't often stay in the plants and in the soil. It gets washed off and it runs off into rivers as fertilizer runoff, and it eventually gets dumped out into the ocean. And this is why we see algal blooms. So in the Gulf of Mexico, we have a very key example. So the Mississippi River dumps out here in Louisiana. And all along this coast, there's like a region, generally like 30 miles offshore, sometimes more, that's considered a dead zone. So what happens is all those fertilizers that are running off from farms farther up the Mississippi River are contributing to massive algal blooms. So they also fertilize the algae and allow them to bloom and grow out of control. But when all those algae die, they decompose. And so then the microbes that decompose the algae, as they're undergoing cellular respiration, are using up all the oxygen in the water. And so it creates this massive dead zone where there is no oxygen. And so marine fish either have to flee or they die because they need oxygen to survive. Another key issue in monoculture farms specifically is erosion. So erosion is when soil is lost, and it is probably an issue you may not have thought about with agriculture before, but it can be pretty significant, especially in a monoculture crop where the field is just bare for a lot of the year. And so this is wind erosion on the American plains in the 1930s. It was a huge issue back during the Great Depression. And so a common thing a lot of farmers do is till their fields to get rid of weeds, but tilling also increases erosion, and the quality of soil significantly declines as the top layer is lost. A way to get around the weed problem is you can plant crops that are herbicide or Roundup resistant. And so when this happens, these plants have been genetically modified to be resistant to Roundup, which is an herbicide, which means it kills plants. So when you apply herbicide to your crop field, it's going to kill all the weeds, but your plants are genetically modified. They're good to go. They will not get killed because they have been genetically modified to have resistance to Roundup. And so it's important to note that this is a way to create Roundup resistant weeds as well, because you're applying selective pressure onto the population. And so eventually you're going to get super weeds that the Roundup is not going to kill, and then you have to resort to more toxic herbicides to get rid of them. This graph here just shows the growth and adoption of the Roundup-Ready RR crops in the United States. So these are crops that have been genetically modified to be resistant to Roundup. And so you can see the most common crops that use this genetic modification are soybeans, cotton, and corn. And if you look at the percentage of planted acres, since 1996, it's been increasing for all of these. So corn is at about 70% of planted acres are planted with this genetically modified corn. And same for cotton, it's about 70%. And then soybeans, it's almost to 90 or 95% of planted acres have this genetically modified soybean. This next graph we're going to look at highlights another one of the issues with monoculture farms when you only are growing one thing. And so the potato blight occurred in Ireland in the 1840s, and it was very tragic. So 1 in 8 people living in Ireland at the time did die due to starvation because this blight was affecting all the potatoes. And it affected all the potatoes because all of the potatoes were genetically identical. It was a monoculture. They didn't have any genetic diversity, and so the potatoes could not develop resistance to the potato blight because that resistance was not there. And so it just wiped out the entire agricultural potato population. What they did after this is they crossed these agricultural potatoes with some wild varieties to increase genetic diversity. And so you can see that potatoes with more genetic diversity after the blight, most of them survived, whereas if all the potatoes are genetically identical, all of them are going to die after the blight. So unfortunately, most of the ones they had before that potato blight were these, but they were able to crossbreed with more wild varieties afterwards to introduce genetic diversity into their population. And this kind of brings up an interesting topic. So in the Arctic, above sea level, there is a global seed vault. It's actually in Svalbard, Norway. And what this stores is basically seeds for all of the plants that we know, especially ones that are important for agriculture. And it's kind of like a prep for any type of doomsday situation where, like in the Irish potato blight, potatoes were wiped out. And it's a prep for that to happen again, except possibly on a wider scale, so that we can restart with the seeds in this vault. If anything were to happen, we would still have those seeds that are so important for agriculture. Another thing that monoculture farms have to worry about is pests. And so we talked about weeds and Roundup. Now we'll talk about insect pests. And so you can prevent pest attacks by either internal or external methods. So some of the internal methods you can genetically modify your plants. And how this works is you would basically make the cells of the plant produce a toxin that kills insects feeding on the plant. And so you genetically modify them, and then any insect feeding on the plant would get killed. You can also prevent pest attacks through external means, such as spraying. So this is going to be spraying pesticides. The leaves and stems can be sprayed with chemicals that are toxic to insects eating the sprayed parts. And so this is a boll weevil feeding on a damaged seed pod of a cotton plant. It's important to note that both these internal and external methods of preventing pest attacks can lead to the evolution of resistance in pest populations to either whatever chemical the plant produces that kills it or whichever chemical is being applied. So we'll look at how evolution or resistance evolves in a pest population where pesticide is actively being applied by an airplane. So in this scenario, we're going to start out with some pests that are attacking crops. These ones look kind of like locusts. They're going to attack the crop. A pesticide is going to be applied, and that pesticide is going to kill most of the pests. However, a few pests with innate resistance are going to survive. Those survivors, the red ones, are going to survive and reproduce, and they're going to reproduce a pesticide-resistant population. So then if you apply the pesticide again, it's going to have little effect because most of the population now has developed resistance to those pesticides. When this occurs, a lot of times what farmers do is they have to resort to switching to a more deadly, toxic pesticide, which can then be even worse for the environment once natural selection has evolved. So is there an alternative to monoculture? We've kind of talked about the reasons that monocultures are not great. They typically have a lot of pesticide and herbicide use. Another thing we didn't really talk about much is that when you only have one crop, a monoculture, it really decreases biodiversity and just like the diversity in the habitat. And so an alternative to monoculture would be to grow more than one thing at one place. So polyculture, poly means many, so polyculture is going to be when you're growing many crops at the same time and often growing crops and animals in conjunction. So polyculture farming focuses on many crops grown in the same place, and polyculture farming is really modeled on ecosystem biology. This just kind of shows a monoculture versus a polyculture, and so this is actually a research project that was done looking at leaf damage and number of beetles on collard greens in a monoculture versus a polyculture. So in the monoculture, it's just all collard beans, nothing else. In a polyculture, there's collard beans and then a row of beans, and then collard greens, and then a row of beans. And what they actually found, if you look at this graph, so this is the number of flea beetles per 10 collards. In the monoculture, there were over 32 beetles per 10 collard plants. In the polyculture, there's just under 4 beetles per 10 collard plants. And this is really cool, and it's most likely due, there's a few things that could be causing this, but one of them is that in this polyculture, the insects may find it more difficult to locate the crop they feed on among the multiple crops. So it's not just everywhere you look, you could find a bean plant right next to you. And if they only eat collard greens, they only want the collard greens. Also, having multiple species, and this, an important note here, it can mean either other crops or just weeds growing in that area, allows for more food and habitats to support other species, such as other insects that might be predators of the pest. So the diversity is providing more habitats for different organisms, including some that may be predators of this beetle. So that could be why we're seeing less over here as well. So theoretically, if you grew collard greens among weeds as well, you could see the same impact. And then the orange is just going to be number of damaged leaves, and you can see that there were more damaged leaves in the monoculture than in the polyculture. A lot of times farmers will rotate crops, and one of the reasons for doing this is nitrogen fixation. So plants require nitrogen, but nitrogen in the atmosphere is not available to them. Certain bacteria can fix nitrogen, such as those that live symbiotically with legumes, such as soy plants or soybeans. If you add legumes to a polyculture or rotate your crops with legumes, it brings usable nitrogen into the soil and puts that in there. So that is why it's so good to plant legumes. And so this is a close-up of the root, and you can just see those nodules where those nitrogen fixing bacteria are. And if they fix excess nitrogen, they just deposit into the soil, which is very good for crops that are grown after a nitrogen fixing crop is grown. Those are some of the benefits of polyculture and growing multiple species at the same time. However, when there are multiple species, the need for manual labor typically increases. So if you have a big monoculture with just the same thing, no weeds, it's very easy to just have a big harvester come through and harvest it. When you have a polyculture, possibly with plants that need to be harvested at different times, it's a lot more labor intensive to harvest it and not mess up the other crops there. And a really good analogy for this one, just compare it to your yard at home. So your monoculture yard of grass is very easy. You can just take it with a riding lawnmower and mow it. But if you have weeds in your garden and want to keep your garden intact, you have to go individually. You have to weed the garden. So it's a lot more labor intensive when you have multiple plants growing together, and you can't just do the same thing for all of them. The next thing we'll talk about is what is sustainable farming and in what ways is it less harmful to the environment than traditional farming. So sustainable farming is typically a type of polyculture. Not all polycultures are classified as sustainable farming, but typically all sustainable farms do practice that polyculture. So some components of sustainable farming, they typically have a polyculture, so lots of different plants growing. They use the application of manure, and then they also have nitrogen-fixing plants planted instead of commercial fertilizer. They try and rely on natural predators instead of insecticides, whether that be birds or other insects. They try and use less fossil fuels in production and in transportation. They're careful about their water usage, so they're not using more water than is needed. They practice soil conservation, so that could be planting plants that help the soil not erode and just being careful about not tilling too much. And they're also committed to not polluting the waterways and trying to rely less on fertilizer and less on insecticides is a great way to decrease the amount of pollution that is going into the waterways. Sustainable animal raising is analogous to sustainable farming, so the same thing. So this right here is an example of not sustainable animal raising. So this is a chicken CAFO, and CAFO just stands for concentrated animal feeding operation. The concentrated animal feeding operations operate under the same principle as the monoculture farms, essentially. They want to produce as much of one product as possible, so as many chickens as possible. And oftentimes, the animals are raised in pretty deplorable, disgusting conditions, and they have to pump them up with a ton of antibiotics because they have so many animals living in close proximity. If they didn't do that, they would lose a ton of their product to diseases. And so they just pump them with antibiotics, even if they're not necessarily sick at the time. And so this just shows here, sustainable farming and sustainable animal raising are on the same side. Monoculture, industrial farming, and CAFOs are over here. And so CAFOs are generally not good for the environment as well as not great for the animals, but environmentally they produce a ton of waste. So all that manure that those animals are generating has to be put somewhere, and it's so many animals in one place that the manure is kind of overwhelming and has to be dealt with. And then also the antibiotics that they're giving them is not ideal because, like we talked about in the antibiotic resistance chapter, agriculture can be a big driver of the development of antibiotic resistance because they are just giving it to these animals all the time in their feed, often. So how can you support sustainable agriculture? A great way is to seek out community-supported agriculture, or CSA. And so in CSA programs, consumers, that's where you buy food directly from local farms. Often it can be an exchange of a set price for a box of in-season food per week. So you might get a box of fresh veggies from a local farm per week. There's also always a good option is the local farmers market. So farmers markets are where local growers and producers are going to come bring their crops. And by going to farmers markets, you're supporting the local economy and also supporting local farmers, which is great because some of the issues with food and using so much fossil fuel is food is grown across the country and then has to be transported to markets. And if you're buying local stuff at a farmer's market, it's already been grown locally, so you're taking out a ton of that fossil fuel that has to be used to transport the food. This next slide here is showing the increase in the sales of organic food and the extent of organic agriculture. So remember, organic food and agriculture means they don't apply pesticides, they don't apply fertilizers, and they're not using genetically modified organisms. And so it's not always analogous with sustainable farming, but a lot of times organic farms are going to be more sustainable. And so you can see up through 2008, the percentage share of all food sales that was attributed to organic products is growing to over 20% of all food sales. And then over here, this is just the sales in millions of dollars. So a little over $22 million in organic food sales in 2008. And that number has just risen now in 2022. And this graph on the right is just showing how many organic operations there are and how many acres are currently in organic production operations. And so you can see this is like pasture or rangeland for cattle typically. cropland, and then certified operations are all those things, and they're all increasing. The general consensus is that it is consumer demand that's driving, or consumer education that's driving the demand for organic products. So as consumers are learning about the bad or the negatives associated with monocultures and how it's not sustainable, they're wanting more sustainable products, and so that's driving the demand for organic products. This map here just shows organic operations around the United States in 2008. Organic operations did account for less than 1% of total crop acreage in 2008, and it's a little bit more than that now. California did lead the production of organic foods in 2008, followed by Wyoming and Texas. Florida, we have about 101 to 300 certified organic operations, so we're not in the lowest numbers, but we're not up towards the highest either. So our food choices typically reflect our values, but a lot of times consumers don't have the facts that they need to make informed choices using current food labels. Also, just because something is organic doesn't mean it's always going to be better for the environment compared to products locally grown with sustainable practices. So let's revisit this choice between two heads of broccoli. One is going to be organic and one is not. Which one is the better choice for the environment? For health? We don't know for sure without more inclusive food labels. If we just go based off what we just talked about, probably the organic one would be, because they're not applying synthetic fertilizers and herbicides. However, if this organic, if this organic head of lettuce had to travel thousands of miles to get to your supermarket, whereas this non-organic one is from a local farm, the environmental impact of buying the non-organic one would be much less than buying the organic one. So it's not always hit and miss. And we also, if you think about which one's better for health, organic foods have been shown to have less pesticide residue. However, non-organic foods can be washed and sometimes peeled, reducing some of that residue. The residue is also not toxic, at least at the levels found on U.S. foods, according to federal standards. However, many consumers do not want any pesticide residue on their food. Also, research has not been conclusive as to whether organic foods are more nutritious than non-organic. The last part in the agriculture section is talking about what farms of the future might look like. So as organic foods become increasingly popular among consumers, the demand for sustainable food will likely continue to increase. With limited resources and a fixed amount of land on Earth, how will farming need to change in the future? Which is what we're about to consider. But before we look at how farming is going to change, I do want to talk about growth models and population sizes. So growth models can predict changes in population size. In its simplest terms, population size is calculated from the number of births minus the number of deaths. Ecologists have developed idealized models to help us better understand changes in population size. So under ideal conditions, exponential population growth is going to occur. So imagine there are no predators, no disease, and plenty of food. Over time, what do you expect will happen to population size? Exponential growth is going to occur when the population size of each new generation is a multiple of the previous generation. And so an example of this is in Australia, rabbits were introduced and they have no natural predators there, and so the population of rabbits exploded. So this is a graph of the exponential growth model, and it does require unlimited resources. So at first the population is going to be small and increase slowly, but then it'll get into this J-shaped curve. And as long as resources do not run out, growth can continue at a tremendous rate, and the population size can just shoot up. However, most populations cannot sustain exponential growth indefinitely. In real-world populations, there are limiting factors, which are going to be environmental constraints that put a cap on the size of a population. One of those is the carrying capacity. It's the maximum population size that can survive in a given environment. Another growth model ecologists have developed is the logistic growth model, and this model is going to incorporate those limiting factors. So what happens if there are factors like predators, disease, or food shortages? And over time, what do you expect will happen to population size? Logistic growth is going to be where the size of a population grows rapidly until it nears its carrying capacity for that environment. What a logistic growth curve looks like is this. So the population is going to start out small, but the growth rate is going to be nearly exponential at first when that population size is small. And so the ideal logistic growth model kind of has an S curve. The growth rate is going to decrease as the population size approaches the carrying capacity for that environment. And then when the population has reached its carrying capacity, the growth rate is 0 and the population is going to stay constant. And so this line here just dictates that carrying capacity. Limiting factors include 2 broad categories. So we have density-dependent factors, which are limiting factors whose influence is affected by population density, such as competition for resources or disease. And then there's going to be density-independent factors, which are unrelated to population density. And those are going to be things like weather or environmental disturbance. Unlike nearly every natural population, humans have demonstrated exponential growth, especially over the last 250 years, and it has not slowed down. So the total human population, which at the time of this PowerPoint was about 7.2 billion, but now in April 2022 is 7.9 billion, continues to rise. And so we're still in this exponential growth curve. So human population growth is exponential. From prehistory until the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, the human population increased very slowly. So you can see the population was very low. Hadn't even hit 1 billion people. But advances in healthcare in like the mid to late 1800s led to an exponential increase in the human population. And so we finally hit 2 billion people by around 1930, 1940, and then it just shot up from there. So population projections suggest that although the birth rate will continue to slow, the human population will continue to increase. And so these blocks represent the birth rate, and then the human population is going to be this red line. Population age structure can inform future population size. So current population growth is affected by the birth rate 15 to 30 years ago, since that is when today's child bearers were born. Age structure can then be used to predict future population size. And so this is a 2010 population where there's a lot of individuals at reproductive ages, fewer older individuals, a lot of young individuals, and then this is going to be the predicted population in 2035. So this population has aged up and is now up here. This population is now up there, and then they have a new population underneath. So looking at human population growth and food production, so a growing world population is going to require more food. And the future of farming has to keep pace with the expected rise in population. So the human population has been growing exponentially since the early 1900s, and it's projected to peak in 2050, right there. And food production is going to need to keep pace with this. However, water, land, and energy are all limited resources, and so farming might need to be reinvented to reflect the reality of how much food we need for the population. So currently, about 70 to 80% of available fresh water in the United States is used for irrigation to grow crops and raise livestock. A 2009 drought, see this year right here, throughout much of Texas, clearly showed how dependent we still are on nature. The extreme drought, which was the worst in approximately 100 years, led to ponds that dried up and ground that was so dry and cracked that many farmers didn't even plant seeds. Texas leads the United States in cotton and beef production. Without much rain, many cotton fields were lost, as were the grazing lands for livestock. It was estimated that close to $4 billion were lost due to livestock loss and low yield from cotton. So that's a huge amount of money that is lost due to this drought. So can you think of any way we could grow crops that puts less stress on the non-renewable resources in the environment, or a way to grow crops that's not beholden to the environment? An answer to that is something called vertical farming. And so this is one concept of a futuristic farm growing food vertically, so this means growing it indoors at several different stories, which is very efficient because it saves space. So just as skyscrapers and cities use less land, farms of the future could save land by building up vertically. Vertical farms would rely on the sun, so solar power, a renewable energy source. They would be indoors in controlled environments without a need for synthetic chemicals to combat insects or weeds, which is a huge benefit over farms right now, which are beholden to nature. They would also recycle water. Vertical farms could be built in urban areas where the majority of people will live, thus eliminating a need to transport the food long distances and saving fossil fuels that would otherwise be used to truck in products. And so urban farming is kind of already a thing. Recently, a lot of restaurants in cities like Boston, Atlanta, and Seattle have began growing food on their own roofs to bring new meaning to the phrase locally grown, and rooftop gardens are already being developed in cities around the world. So this is kind of the future, a possible theorized future of farming, but we are going to need to be able to produce enough food for the projected peak in global population by 2050. So that concludes our agriculture section. The next section of this lecture is going to be talking about genetically modified organisms. So what are some examples of genetically modified organisms? These are the official definitions from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So genetic modification is going to be the production of heritable improvements in plants or animals for specific uses via either genetic engineering or other more traditional methods. And then a genetically modified organism, a GMO, is going to be an organism produced through genetic modification. And I did list sources on here, and I just wanted to do a quick caveat that when you're looking at information or looking at resources for things, it's important to find credible sources. And so, especially around polarizing topics that can have a lot of viewpoints on either side, you do want to find credible sources that are scientifically backed. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture is an example of a credible source. Both plants and animals can be genetically modified. Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, are ones that have acquired one or more genes through artificial means. If the transferred gene is from another species, then the organism is called a transgenic organism. So this transgenic goat right here carries a gene for a human enzyme called lysozyme. And we'll talk a little bit in a few slides about why researchers did that. So the use of GM, or genetically modified organisms, in agriculture has become widespread. The majority of corn, soybean, and cotton grown in the United States is genetically modified. And in 2015, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, approved the first transgenic fish for consumption, which was a salmon that reaches full size faster than wild salmon. How are genetically modified organisms made? So you're going to start out with a plant cell or an animal cell that has a gene of interest. You're going to cut out that gene. You're going to take a plasmid from bacteria. We've kind of talked about this process before in cloning, so I'm going to just briefly go over this. You take a plasmid from bacteria, you cut open the plasmid, you insert that gene that you cut out, and now you have a recombinant plasmid. You're then going to inject that into plant cells or a mammalian embryo. So genetically modified food crops can be produced by inserting a desired gene into a plasmid. The plasmid carries a new gene which becomes inserted into the plant's genome. The plant is then going to express the trait from the newly inserted gene. And so, once again, we have a plasmid, we have the desired gene, we'll put them together, get a recombinant plasmid. The recombinant plasmid is then going to be injected into plant cells growing in the laboratory, and then it'll be grown. And so we have a resulting genetically modified plant. How common are genetically modified crops? So this graph is made from data found on the USDA's website, and you can see that this is the percent of all planted corn and soybeans, and so both of them are close to 90% of all varieties of that crop that are planted are genetically modified. So they are quite common. Most corn and soybeans grown in the U.S. are genetically modified. What are genetically modified animals used for? So there's a few different things. Genetically modified animals are currently used for creating pharmaceuticals and for organ transplants. And then the first transgenic salmon fish was approved for human consumption in a few years ago. So these genetically modified pigs are used for organ transplants. This goat is genetically modified to produce a protein that is used in pharmaceuticals. And then this salmon is genetically modified to grow faster and reach market size years before other salmon. And so looking more specifically at this goat example, pharmaceutical companies have produced GM animals that secrete certain drugs. And so once again, we're going to start out with a plasmid and our desired gene. We're going to cut the gene from the chromosome, cut open the plasmid, insert that gene into the plasmid, and now we're going to have a recombinant plasmid. The recombinant plasmid can then be injected into mammalian cells growing in the laboratory. Some of these cells will take up the new gene and produce its protein. In that case, the new protein can be harvested, purified, and used to treat medical conditions. Or you can insert the recombinant plasmid into mammalian embryos. The recombinant embryos are then going to be implanted in surrogate mothers, and then those surrogate mothers are going to give birth, and this transgenic offspring is now going to carry a gene for an enzyme called lysozyme, which is the enzyme we were talking about earlier. This enzyme, found naturally in breast milk, has antibacterial properties, and so they would produce this transgenic goat to get that lysozyme enzyme. Oops, wrong way. The last thing we're going to talk about today is, are genetically modified organisms safe? So try and think of some pros and cons of genetically modified organisms that we have already talked about. So some of the pros: genetically modified organisms can produce products like that lysozyme enzyme that we would not otherwise be able to get. Also, if you think about plants that have been modified to have herbicide resistance, it allows us to keep growing those plants and apply herbicides, which can be a good thing or can be a bad thing if you're looking at it from an environmental perspective. I will say one thing we have not talked about is some genetically modified foods, like there's a type of rice that has been genetically modified to contain vitamin A, because a lot of populations that rely on rice as a primary component of their diet can be deficient in vitamin A, and so that rice that has vitamin A is a much healthier option for communities that rely a lot on rice. So that's one benefit of genetically modified organisms. This next case study we're going to look at is going to examine whether genetically modified foods are safe to consume. So this graph here shows the number of white blood cells in 4 different groups with various amounts of genetically modified organisms in their diet. Blood cell counts like this one are used to indicate overall health. And so you can see there's this bar for the people with 0 GMOs in their diet is slightly higher than the others, but these things called error bars are kind of like the range of uncertainty. And since these error bars all overlap, basically what we conclude is that there's really not a difference in white blood cell count between these different groups because the error bars are going to be overlapping. This graph here is going to show, so that one was the white blood cell count. This one's going to be the red blood cell count, and this one is even closer. So the bars are all very similar and the error bars all overlap again. So basically what we can conclude is they're not any more dangerous than regular foods to consume. So throughout the course of this lecture, have your views about GMOs changed based on what you have learned? If so, how did they change? What are your concerns about GMOs? And what do you find beneficial about GMOs? So GMOs in general can be very helpful, and they have allowed us to better utilize animal and plant products, and they have not been shown to be any more unhealthy than non-GMO options. However, there are some issues with them in, like, they encourage the use, if we're looking at monocultures, the genetically modified organisms that are resistant to herbicide or that can have been modified to be able to kill a pest species. The pest species ones can lead to the development of resistance to that compound in the plants. And also the herbicide resistant ones can lead to herbicide being applied, which eventually leads to the development of resistance in weed populations. But overall, hopefully throughout the course of this lecture, you learned a lot about agriculture and genetically modified organisms. If you would like to learn more, this is just a big summary of websites that have information on these topics.